Hey all, here OS Reviews. In this video, we'll be taking a closer look at Tizen OS, as well as kind of its history and how it sits in the current crop of mobile OSs out in 2018. Now, to call Tizen completely home-brewed by Samsung is a little misleading because it's actually created by the Linux Foundation, and this is a group of companies that includes Samsung as one of the key hardware partners, but also includes companies like Fujitsu, Panasonic, for instance, but also chip makers like Intel. Samsung is still the dominant force when it comes to developing most of Tizen OS products, just because many of the other hardware partners haven't released anything yet, despite the fact that the OS was released over 5 years ago. Now, in that 5-year span, Tizen has seen just 5 phones, and all of them have relatively low-end hardware, so they're again meant to compete in the budget territory as well as in developing countries and nations, as opposed to being kind of a flagship OS that's supposed to compete with the likes of iOS or Android. And as such, the tenets of Tizen are supposed to be lightweight, very flexible, offering good battery life performance, and offering web app compatibility. So that means many of the programs are written in HTML5, C or C++, very similar to Firefox OS powered phones. And of course, in Firefox OS, we know that there's now KaiOS in 2018, which is also used to power super low-end devices, mostly flip phones and feature phones, in fact. But because of this technology, it's able to install more programs and apps than on, say, Android because they don't take up as much space. Pretty much you can just tap on an app and it just takes you to the browser. It's basically just a mobile version of the site that's been optimized to run just a little bit faster. So going back to kind of where Tizen OS stands in terms of its release history, so we can see that this is where Tizen is, and we can tell that it's kind of a sub-branch of operating systems like MeeGo. We saw MeeGo on the Nokia N9, so it's kind of interesting how this is kind of inspiration, at least parts of the code, for what Tizen is. And Tizen 2.0 and above are also inspired by Bada, which is kind of Samsung's true homebrewed OS that they completely created from the ground up that was released about a decade ago. And luckily enough, we've covered both of those devices in the past. So we do have a phone, here's a Nokia N9, that uses the MeeGo operating system, and perhaps we'll be able to see some similarities as we take a closer look at Tizen OS here. And we also have a Bada OS phone. This is the Wave 525, and the Wave series from Samsung, again, about 10 years ago, all ran on Bada OS. And from here, maybe we're also able to see a little bit of similarities with how things are designed. Now, part of the reason why we're taking a look at Tizen today is because there is the argument that with Google being fined $5 billion by the EU for antitrust violations, some people are speculating that we'll soon be seeing the end of Android and a shift by Google to Fuchsia, which is their kind of developing mobile operating system that's trying to unify smart devices as well as give more consistent kind of platform updates on the road and makes Android less open source and more kind of in the hands and control of Google, so to speak. And if that does happen, then many think that Samsung would simply shift to using Tizen OS on all of their phones going forwards. So starting with Bada, now a difference with Bada and Tizen is, first of all, Tizen is, again, in support with the Linux Foundation, so it does have more people working on the project than just Samsung alone. It's also a little different because the strategy employed by Samsung was different when it came to their product releases running on Bada. For one, there were more flagship-oriented phones, including the first Samsung Wave, the Wave 2 and the Wave 3 were all expensive devices that had AMOLED screens and pretty cutting-edge hardware for the time, compared to Tizen phones, which are pretty much all low-end. With Bada, we have just basically pages that we can scroll sideways, and it looks very similar to what we expect with Android on top of maybe TouchWiz. And there's also a list of apps that we can then go into as a drawer to swipe through all of our programs. But still, you can tell how animations are choppier. They're not quite as responsive and smooth. And it's also more closed. It's more traditional. It doesn't have any web apps. So it's more similar to an operating system like Android in that sense. With Amigo, again, it was mostly used by Nokia, and it was in fact only used on the Nokia N9. The closer ancestor to Nokia would be Sailfish OS, which has now been used by Vodafone, but again, it does offer a slightly more sleek overall experience because MeeGo, just like WebOS, is completely gesture-based, whereas Tizen still relies on physical keys to go back, open up menus, as well as go into the home screen and access multitasking with MeeGo and WebOS, you're able to command everything using a series of swipes. So for instance, if I want to exit out of this, I can just swipe up and it'll be open as a card on this third page here. The second page is basically for notifications and for weather, and this main page is just for apps. So we can tell that for MeeGo, everything is for the most part vertically scrolling when it comes to apps, and then we can scroll sideways to access kind of separate features or separate panels. And that's, again, a very similar concept to what we see on Tizen for accessing, again, a full list of our applications. And we also have access to kind of the ability to swipe on the edges here to have access to different features such as an alarm clock or time and date. But what it gets rid of is that center screen for multitasking. And in fact, if we look a little closer at kind of these icons, you can tell how, again, it does look kind of similar when it comes to the overall fonts as well as the kind of text being used. So you can definitely tell that both were developed by the Linux Foundation with things like the clock, for instance, things like the video icons. All of these, again, look very similar to one another. So as aforementioned in our review, Tizen OS is built in a hybrid fashion where we have physical apps which are stored into the phone's memory, such as things like utility apps. We have a clock, we have a calculator, we have the ability to create memos, for instance. You can also store things and view back documents in PDF, for instance. But at the same time, you're also able to find web apps. And this hybrid nature is what allows the platform to be a bit more flexible and lightweight, especially on phones with limited built-in memory, like this one, which has just 4 gigs of built-in storage. In settings, we can take a closer look at some of the advanced things that we can tweak in Tizen, such as themes and wallpapers. So you can change the color as well as how the icons look. So kind of similar to what TouchWiz offers, but it's slightly more advanced. You also have access to special day wallpapers. And since this phone was targeted at the Indian market, you're able to do things like select special wallpaper designs for holidays in India. So that's kind of an interesting feature built into the settings directly. Now, in terms of lock screens and security, you don't have access to things like drawing a pattern. You also can't use a fingerprint because there's no sensor on this model. In fact, there's no fingerprint sensor on any of the phones running on Tizen so far. Now, in terms of accounts, you can actually create quite a few and add them on. So whether it's a separate Google account, you can still log in to access your Gmail, for instance. You can also sign into Dropbox from here, sync with Facebook, Microsoft Exchange. So there is, again, support for some other companies and platforms aside from what only Samsung is offering. The way that power and storage is visualized is also a little bit different. You have access to just a large icon showing you the percentage left. You can also take a look at what applications are using the most amount of battery life or memory on your device. And you can also activate a super power saving mode, which allows us to basically turn off Wi-Fi. It allows us to extend the battery life of the device. It dims the display as well, and only gives us access to core features like calling, for instance. Finally, under About Device, you're able to see the version of Tizen OS you're running on. In addition, you can check for software updates, which are pushed over the air, but you can't see any software kind of Easter eggs compared to, let's say, Google. There's not as much personality there. So even if you keep on tapping on Tizen version, it's not going to pop up something like on Android. It also tells you the CPU usage on the bottom here along with the battery power, which is actually kind of interesting. But you can tell that, again, it's pretty low-end hardware because CPU usage is usually 0%, but after kind of moving it, the usage just spikes up for a second. So you can tell that's definitely not the most powerful thing in the world. And that's it. You don't get any of the crazy gestures that we're used to seeing from Samsung and their kitchen sink approach on Android. There's nothing like double tap to wake. There's nothing like flipping the phone over to mute a call. So all of these things are gone and you get a pretty bare bones experience. Maybe that's part of the reason why everything is still feels so fast and responsive on a low-end device. But one software trick that you do have is double clicking on the home key on any Tizen OS phone to access the camera. Here's the Tizen store, and again, it's easily the weakest element of most Tizen OS phones just because they are very limited, especially considering, again, the bulk of Tizen devices in the US being sold are either TVs or smartwatches, and those obviously won't run versions of apps like Opera Mini. So essentially, they're developing these apps for 5 phones that they have on the market, so it's not going to be a huge selection. But you can still find a few workarounds to things like productivity tools and whatnot, but definitely not nearly as wide of a selection as on the catalogs of Android and iOS. So that's more or less it as far as our closer in-dive look at Bada OS, kind of its history, the similarities it shares with its brother operating systems, including MeeGo and Bada, as well as kind of what it implies for Samsung. I do think that the overall interface feels very sleek and responsive. Everything is very snappy. It's for sure a lot faster feeling than what you'll find on KaiOS with Firefox OS, so the code I think is better written there. It's more similar to what we saw with MeeGo, which is just very sleek, very fast in terms of the UI navigation, despite low-end hardware. As consumers, we want more and more options just because that gives us more freedom to choose what we want, and it also keeps things interesting as well. It prevents one operating system from monopolizing the entire market. Even if Samsung is still kind of the underdog here with Tizen, it does have promise, and at least for me, feels like something a little fresh and different from the norm. So you can check out more details about Tizen OS as well as this phone and other kind of Tizen OS powered phones in the links down below. But for now, that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews, and that's been a closer look at Tizen OS on mobile devices.